This next speaker, her first concert was from Rick Springfield. She's a little friend of mine. You should know, including being a Lectora expert, she also makes really tasty cake balls. I can't wait to hear more about that. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Crix Paxton. Give her a round of applause. Here she comes.
Hello, and
hey, Chris.
Yeah, I enjoy baking, so I make cake balls and cookies for my clients and send them out for the holidays. Although one of my clients this year, I got them out in the mail late, and they said the ants really enjoyed them. The postal carrier just left them on the steps. So,
well, Chris, my address is 45 Brook Street, Croton on Hudson, 10520. I look forward to that. Floor is yours.
Okay, you lost the
Have
card.
a great time.
Just send me, send me things I enjoy. It's a nice stress relief to the baking. So baking is.
I love to eat.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chrisana. I go by Chris Paxton McMillan, and I am the president of D3 Training Solutions and a trusted consultant of eLearning Brothers, Interactive Advantage, and UAchieve, all big Lectora users. I am a white cis female in my early 50s. I wear glasses. I have a graying blonde hair, and my pronouns are she and her. Now, I've actually been in the training and development field since '98, and have over 20 years actually in the distance learning field. I'm going to say I started when I was 6. But let me tell you, it has been amazing to see the changes in the development and really how it has evolved. And I'm hoping, since most of you in today's sessions are in the course Authoring as Developers, that as learning developers, obviously, we work very hard to develop interesting, educating, and hopefully very engaging courses, especially after sitting through Dominic's session. And since we work so hard at developing our content, our goal should be to enhance the quality of learning and meet the learning style of as many people as possible. Now, learning styles, when we say that term, most often people think of that as visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or physical, and those are very important. But I want to challenge all of us that we need to think about so much more. If we are to ensure knowledge is delivered clearly, concisely to and for everyone, we need to develop our courses to meet the needs of all of our learners by ensuring that our courses are accessible by people with limitations or disabilities. And again, you work hard on your e-learning content. Don't you want as many people as possible to actually learn from it? Now, I saw you guys responded so well with Dominic, and I loved, I've got to put a plug in for a couple of things he said about, and you're going to hear the same thing, library objects, templates, style guides. You're going to hear that same thing too. I have been using Lectora since I think about 2004. Do use some other products, but if I've got to build something accessible, actually, even if I don't, Lectora is my go-to product. So I'm just going to put that plug in there. Let's see. Oh, and keep putting stuff in the chat and chatting. So yes, my mom is blind. I've seen her struggle. And I think that's probably part of it. I had my first eye surgery and started wearing glasses before I was 3 years old, but my great aunt was blind. And it's just amazing to see and watch it work. So, okay, let's go ahead. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen yet. Way to go. Hang on just a second, minimize that. I got so caught up with the cake balls. For those coming in later, like, what is she talking about? Share screen. There you go. Let's keep that up there. Okay, have to just rearrange things a little bit. So today, we're going to talk about understanding inclusivity and accessibility, why it matters, why is it important. We're going to show some examples. We're going to look at some tools and checklists. And at the end, I've got 2 ebooks to offer you to assist with both of these items. When we think about this, though, the surge in popularity of these terms, inclusive and accessibility, recently really seems to have resulted in a blurring of the boundaries and confusion around really what each of them means. And I often see these terms used interchangeably and have fielded questions from clients and other designers alike about whether or not they are, in fact, the same thing. So to allow us to kind of tease apart the confusion and dig in the differences, we're going to need a greater understanding of each of the terms. And we're going to start with accessible, since accessible design is the older of the two concepts. But first, a question. And Stephanie, can you go ahead and post that question for me?
Yes, I will launch that poll right now. And you can click right on the screen to share your level of experience with building accessible learning.
So again, what best describes you? And yeah, I'm sure I'm going to be bombarded by addresses. Send cake balls.
Everybody wants the cake balls. I'm sorry, guys. That's not part of the virtual conference. I
can send the recipe. It's really easy. And my cookies aren't pretty. I want to take a class, but they really taste good. And if you guys want to get motivated, watch those kid baking challenge shows. These little kids are amazing what they can do in the
oh my gosh,
in
I
the
love
kitchen.
Those baking shows. It's just amazing. The things you can like turn a cake into and make it look like, it's crazy.
Try the kids baking ones. That will just really inspire you to get into the kitchen because you're like, wow, this 8-year-old can do it. Surely I can do it.
All right, so I'll give you guys a couple more minutes to fill out this poll and let us know. It looks like we've got pretty split right now on different levels of experience and accessibility. So I think everybody's going to get a lot out of this presentation. Great. I will end that and I'll share these results for everybody to see.
Okay, curious, great. Okay, so 38% are curious about accessible e-learning, 35% actively working on accessibility compliance requirements, 27 not required, but accessibility matters, yes. And I'll show you guys some ways you can go ahead and slip that in there. And other, none of those. So, okay, great. Then let's go ahead and continue on. Whoops, there, sorry, I left that one in there. So when we think about inclusivity and accessibility, at its simplest, inclusivity is a practice or policy of including people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those who have physical or mental disabilities, members of minority groups. It requires a greater understanding and empathy and asks that you put yourself in someone else's shoes. Now, I was really excited about what I heard on the news this weekend, and maybe you did too, that Disney's latest animation, Encanto, the main character, Mirabel, wears glasses. Now, for some of you guys, you may be thinking this is not a big deal because around 6 of every 10 people in the world wear glasses. But Mirabel could actually be the first Disney heroine to wear glasses. And again, that may not seem like a big deal, but as someone who actually, again, my first eye surgery and my first wearing glasses was before I was 3 or 4 years old, I know I would have loved to have seen someone like me on the screen wearing glasses because that just didn't happen. So inclusive design isn't concerned with logistics of whether everyone can use it, but whether everybody wants to use it and ultimately whether they feel safe in using it, while accessible design ensures that everyone can hear, read, and or see your message. Basically, they can take your course. So the first thing we all have to realize is that every learner is different, whether they are different ages, races, or genders, whether they have specific content accessibility needs, pre-existing knowledge about your training content, or no experience at all. Every learner comes to your training with a different background and with different expectations. Now, hopefully, we all agree that every learner deserves an opportunity to have access to knowledge. That's, again, why we're here. And it's up to all of us, whether we're in HR, training and development, e-learning professionals, whatever it may be, to know how to effectively deliver that content. Technology, love it. It's really good. And it brings the world together in many ways and enables content delivery on a broad scale. But there's still some challenges to creating inclusive and accessible content. Now, this is from a Brandon Hall survey, and it shows that on a scale of 1 to 5, 48% are slightly resistant, and this is businesses, or less to changing strategies, processes, and behaviors to be more inclusive. Yet more than 60% of organizations believe diversity, equity, and inclusion, often referred to as DE&I, are important drivers of business results. In fact, they're so important that studies actually show that you'll have more sales, increase awareness of your brand, you'll have retention of skilled employees. It also lowers the recruitment cost because you've got lower turnover. You attract new employees, improve staff morale, greater engagement, all these things that we want within our companies. When we think about, or when we asked about accessibility, we can see it's kind of equal here, that we've got 25% that are currently mentoring people with disabilities, and 25% are developing people with disabilities, and 27% have plans to do it. Okay. Now, I'm probably in a bit of a silo as I create a lot of accessibility courses and try to be as active as I can in the accessibility world. But from an e-learning software trainer, we are seeing more developers wanting to learn how to develop for accessibility, and an increased awareness and interest in things like our Lectora Accessibility User Group, which we'll talk about again at the end of the session, and the Lectora accessibility training courses. So. Okay, now when we think about in this picture, you're like going, what in the world are you showing me? Believe it or not, diversity in the workplace actually was a much debated topic as far back as World War II. Whoops, I went too far there. It was around this time that many women entered the employment to cover the major workforce shortages due to men carrying out their military services. Now, note a lot of the following decades saw women opportunities for employment severely curtailed. In 1948, Truman signed an executive order, which was the first legal move to desegregate the U.S. Army, which until that point had actually been, for the most part, segregated based on ethnicity. But now here we are, 74 years later, that go on there. And while diversity and inclusion of people with disabilities and people that are just different than us possibly in the workplace has come on in leaps and bounds, we all know the work isn't done yet. According to Forbes magazine, job postings for a chief diversity officer, referred to as the CDO, has risen 35% in the last 2 years, with many businesses publishing a diversity report. So diversity is a key aspect of that recruitment and talent acquisition. Well, it needs to continue on in the training world, and not just that once a year diversity training. It needs to be included in all of our training and how we develop. So, obviously, some of these numbers I'm going to ask you guys are going to overlap, but I'd like you to take a sheet of paper out, the pen, or just kind of write it down or think about it. But I have some questions for you guys. And some of these numbers, as I said, are going to overlap, but it's a great example that most companies should be thinking about accessibility. Now, when I work with clients, I ask about their accessibility needs, and often their response is that they don't have any because they don't have any employees that are blind or deaf. They kind of categorize it that way. And that may be the case in your workforce. And often they'll say, well, I'm not required to. So I'm going to ask you guys a few questions here. And the first one to think about is, how many total people do you have at your place of business? And then do your little math here. What is 20% of that number? Give you guys a second to do that. Once you have that total number, and some of this may be guesstimation unless you really are in HR and you have the numbers there, but of your total employees, how many people are over the age of 40? Okay. Work for a global company. Okay, your numbers are going to be huge then. Maybe think about the ones in the US. Okay, or whatever country you're calling from, I should say. Then think about your total employees and how many of them are males. Okay, so I'll give you a minute to write that down. What's your total number of people working there? What's 20% of that? Then what do you think of that total number is over the age of 40? And then what is the total number of males? And I know you're wondering, what kind of strange questions is she asking? But you'll see here in a minute. I ask these things because, first, again, these numbers we just looked up or talked about are going to overlap. But I think as we look at this information, it's a great it's a great example that most companies should think about accessibility. So let's look at these numbers a little closer. I said, how many total people work there? What is 20%? Well, in the United States, approximately 20% of Americans have at least one disability. And I think that number is going to increase completely, because I've never really thought I am dyslexic. So I had some special ed classes when I was younger, great tutors, and I've worn glasses all my life. I've never considered that a disability until some recent stuff. And it's like, I guess I do identify that way, and that's something to be aware of. So I think we're going to see that number increase. The next question, yeah, great question right there. It is really hard. And just as a trans person, just kind of however you feel at the moment. So as far as the age of 40, beginning at the age of early to mid 40s, many adults may start to have problems seeing clearly at close distances, especially when reading and working on a computer. And again, I think those numbers are also going to increase because we've got kids starting to look at electronics and stuff a lot younger. So they're not hearing, don't sit so close to the TV like we did when we were kids, step away from the computer. This is a very common problem that adults develop between the ages of 41 and 60, and this normal change in the eyes focusing will continue to progress over time. Okay. Last but not least, how many males work there? And I would say for this one, that's a good question. If you were talking trans, I would probably then go back to the biological sex, because there's a difference between gender and sex, just because I'm thinking the DNA aspect of it. Everyone sees color a little differently, though. Even people who aren't colorblind, but 1 in 12 men are colorblind, okay, which means something you assigned at birth, exactly. So although some of people aren't assigned at birth, they just kind of let them decide as they get older. But yes, people have the XY chromosome. Great way. Thank you. I need to remember that one. So things that we may not have thought of, we need to take into consideration by far. And I had someone else comment, and great. It says, I think we often ignore disabilities that may not be easy to observe or are just not so disruptive. For example, certain learning disabilities. Exactly. And that is something, again, I've never really thought about that for me, but I probably should have. So got some good discussions going on there. Genetic mutation. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so when we think about accessibility, what is it that we're meaning? Accessibility concerns the structures really in that container that holds your information. It's the channels that carry your training courses and the way your information is actually formatted and presented. We see on here, it's WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. This is developed by the World Wide Web Consortium. Say that off fast, or W3C. They develop the web standards such as HTML, CSS, and they develop our Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, which are the global set of guidelines followed around the world. These WCAG documents explain how to make web content more accessible to people with these disabilities. Now, some people wonder, I'm not developing web stuff, I'm developing training. Well, within training and development, Section 508 is the actual set of the 50 guidelines we reference based upon WCAG. So I would encourage everyone, if you haven't read the latest WCAG guidelines, to go through and read. I've got those links here. You'll see those links also in the books that we are sharing. And if you haven't already, they provide a really solid foundational understanding of a lot of the key concepts behind designing with accessibility in mind. The other thing you need to do is know your audience. Accessibility is based on a set of guidelines, but each individual organization must determine which level they need to comply with. To do this, an audience analysis needs to be performed to understand who your accessible learners are and what specific requirements they have. Even when my clients say they don't need accessibility, I pretty much do level A. And we can see on here, I've got A, AA, and AAA. And as a best practice, A is the lowest. It sets the minimum level of accessibility primarily for visual and hearing limitations and does not achieve really broad accessibility for many situations. If your course meets level A, the majority of users will be able to use the course. When you conform to the higher level, so let's say double A, that also means that you're meeting the lower A, which is mid-range. And by conforming to double A, a course meets obviously A and double A standards. Triple A is the highest. According to W3Org website, it really is not recommended that AAA conformance be required as a general policy for entire sites because it's not possible to satisfy all level AAA success criteria for some content. So again, that you really need to get to know your audience. Okay. Then we need to think about, well, what are we talking about here? Well, we've kind of addressed this a little bit. We're talking about visual, which would include blindness, low vision, color blindness, glaucoma, farsightedness, nearsightedness, and astigmatism, or some of us have all of that depending on which eyeball it's in. It also includes hearing, not just deafness, but hard of hearing and hearing loss. Our motor, which references those physical impairments, has e-learning developers. We are concerned with dexterity issues, especially with this, the mouse, the keyboard. This could be things that could be loss or damage of limbs, arthritis, paralysis, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, cerebral palsy, and so forth. And then our cognitive, which takes us to, and I'm so glad I've got Daryl and Christine adding some stuff in, which takes us to those learning difficulties. It could include things like Down syndrome, in addition to neurodiverse conditions such as dyslexia, ADHD, mental health like anxiety, attention deficit, vision, all of those things are included. So now that you have a little bit more knowledge about accessibility, okay, I've kind of hopefully really broadened that for you. When you think about what accessibility means within your company, thinking of, again, people born with XY chromosome, or men over 40, basically, 20%, people over 40, do you visualize maybe that you should be developing accessible content? And I hope now if we ask that question, that number would be much higher. Because we also want to think about, and this can be kind of scary, or not so scary, we need to think about not only age-related, but also situational or temporary impairments, such as an accident with a broken arm or hearing or vision loss. Now, I don't know what happened, but several years ago, I lost my hearing for 6 weeks. Went to all kinds of specialists. We still don't know what happened, but I can go back if it ever happens again. There wasn't fluids, all kinds of stuff, but excuse me, sorry about that. But what happens when your best IT specialist breaks their right arm and they're right-handed, or has a weekend warrior, they sprain their wrist? What do you do? Well, previously you'd send them to training, but now training is all online. Well, they can sit in front of the thing, but they can't use the mouse. So are your courses, are they developed to where they are keyboard accessible and they can tap through them? Okay. Do you have that in mind? Or maybe you work for a place that nobody ever gets hurt. Okay. Yeah. We probably don't. So it's a lot to think about and really something we all should consider. Now, I'm not going to go into all this because I want to go into, or I'm not going to go in real deep on here, but POUR is an acronym for 4 high-level principles that describe this functional accessibility. In addition to websites, most other information technology can be made accessible by applying the POUR. And basically, when the upgrades back in 2008 when the guidelines were upgraded to version 2.1, they grouped the initial 14 guidelines into these 4 principles. The first one is perceivable. This means that the user must be able to take in the content in one way or another. It cannot be invisible to all senses. So let's say you have some text and there are important words highlighted in a different color, but the learner can't distinguish between the colors. The learner would actually be missing critical information, thus your content isn't perceivable. Or maybe there's an image that the student can't see and there isn't any text or alt text, which we'll talk about, giving a description for the assistive technology, often a screen reader, to read. Great question. How does keyboard accessibility work when your course is highly interactive, i.e. an escape room that doesn't use typical navigation? Each one is really unique, and there's some stuff that we honestly can't necessarily at this point in time make accessible. And great comment here. Thank you. Yeah. So it may be one of those that you may not want to use. Okay. But I want to stress there's so many things you can do to make things accessible and still be interesting. Okay. And fun. Okay. Let's see. Operable. There's still, yeah, exactly. Christine, you guys may notice, Christine, and let me do a plug-in with Christine. I mentioned the LAUG. Christine has founded it and helped co-write one of the e-learning books out there. So definitely notice what she types in the chat. So our operable, again, means the users must be successfully, can they do it? What's expected of them using only a keyboard. They don't rely on the mouse. Now, this could also be things like the buttons are large enough to get their cursor on if using a mouse, or the content maybe shouldn't move too fast with a method maybe to control that pace, whether it be navigating to another page or completing the interactivity. The interface cannot require an interaction that the user just can't do. Okay. Great things coming in there. So sorry. Understandable. This means that the users must be able to fully comprehend the content presented as well as the way it is presented. The content or operation must not go beyond their cognitive ability to understand. An example would be that if the navigation actions, a thing we suggest, are consistent and predictable, they become easier to understand. The learner knows that by selecting a certain icon or button, that specific result will occur. And last but not least, robust. This means as technology and devices evolve, as it will, content should remain available to the users. Now, the first three principles, the POU, those focus on the end user, and the last one focuses on the technology that delivers the content to the end user. Now, when we think of inclusivity, again, practice or policy, I kind of read over that, but to use a physical analogy, let's imagine a very old, very traditional, members-only gentlemen's club with a grand old clubhouse that is hundreds of years old, okay? Now, let's say that club decided it was time to modernize in order to meet the new accessibility requirements, and they took the time to fit wheelchair ramps, handrails, an elevator, hearing aid induction loops. After all of those alterations, the clubhouse would definitely be much more accessible, but as a very traditional club that doesn't allow female members and has a very substantial joining fee, could the club ever really be considered an inclusive space? No. So when we think about inclusivity, while accessible design is concerned that everyone can, again, hear, see, read, see your message, inclusive design asks you to consider the message itself. This requires a greater level of understanding and empathy, as I said before, and it is content that is truly created for everyone. Okay? Does everyone want to use it? It's not that they can, but whether they want to, and ultimately whether they feel safe using it. So, when we think about inclusivity, it lives or dies based on the information itself and on your audience and empathy with your audience. So, what are you trying to say? Are you speaking from a position of privilege? What points are you trying to make? Is your perspective clouded by bias, unconscious or otherwise? And we all have biases. Again, our brain, the way it works, we process things and we make shortcuts. So just realize we all have them, and as soon as we acknowledge them, we can learn to work around them and to make sure we're not including our biases. How will your message make people feel? Make sure I'm on the right one there. Could your message or design be viewed as discriminatory or offensive? Is your view based solely on your own experiences? And does it exclude certain demographics or people? Okay. Now, a great comment came in, and It's funny you say that. Leslie wrote, in my company, my biggest challenge is reminding the content owners that they need to write their content for new employees at an 8th grade or lower reading level. You guys, some of this stuff I feel like is so ingrained in me because as a journalism major in my undergrad, that is what we taught. That is what we were taught, right at an 8th grade reading level. It's not as if people can't read at a higher level. They completely can. But comprehension level for most people, because we're reading things so fast, is going to be easier at that 8th grade level. So maybe present it that way. It's not that people can't read at a higher level. It's just that the comprehension, they will understand it better and quicker and get your message through writing at that level. It just makes it easier for them. So, okay. Now, how do we design e-learning for all of these unknown variables that we just mentioned? Well, inclusive design concepts need to be thoughtfully included from the ground up. Diversity and inclusion needs to be on the top of your mind when creating, developing, and delivering learning. And I think that's why, I don't want to say it comes easy to me, but some of this stuff was just taught for so long in my journalism courses. Because inclusive design, though, isn't a design practice, but a philosophy of designing for one and extending it to many. The other thing we need to keep in mind is by 2050, a majority of the workforce will be, and this comes from the Department of Labor, considered minorities. Being inclusive is the right thing to do so that your workforce accurately reflects the community by large. And by casting that wider net and hiring diversely, you increase your company's collective creativity and innovative capability. When diversity and inclusion create an atmosphere of creativity and acceptance, it improves retention rates overall. Now, when it comes to designing for inclusivity and diversity, my first and most important, again, point is that I'm a white cis female designer in an industry already dominated by white cis designers. If you fit that description, then the advice I want to offer you is to get comfortable being uncomfortable. As Verna Myers, a diversity and inclusion advocate, says in her TED Talk, if you want to overcome your biases, you must walk boldly towards them. Confront them. Actively seek out conversations and situations that put you outside of your comfort zone. Listen to, read, and follow authors and designers that are radically different from you in all kinds of ways. It'll be a huge help in inspiring you to do your best for all. Okay. The second quote that she has is, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is actually being asked to dance. And how many times have we probably all been to the party and not asked to dance? So let's take this a little further in and talk about some practices. The first thing we want to do is identify and remove biases in our writing. The general idea is to remove as much bias, including, again, that unconscious bias, so you've got to become aware of it, as possible. And to do this, a diverse group of people and perspectives should be included in the design process from the very beginning, along with diverse groups in the development and beta testing. Again, bias is natural. Unconscious bias can be overcome. I kind of mentioned this before, but the human brain, we are flooded with pieces of information about the world we live in. When presented with all of this information, the brain creates these shortcuts. So if we, especially as instructors and developers, are aware of our own biases and countering those stereotypes, we can reduce the strength and effort of our unconscious bias. So make certain to focus on bias-free, inclusive language before, during, and after constructing your script, layout, and visual design. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Talk to your clients about bias and diversity. Inclusion and diversity must be considered from the beginning of any e-learning project. Simply revising images and media is not enough. We need to actively examine the ways we promote diversity within our training, marketing, materials, and businesses. One question that actually surprises people is when I ask about the diversity for the company, the workforce, and their clientele. And some of my questions include, what are the company or organization's demographics? Do they have an equal split of men to women in their company? Are they LGBTQIA plus inclusive? Do they employ impaired and or disabled individuals? And again, where are they located, in the US or abroad? These are all things to keep in mind when developing and designing training. Now, we are reading, seeing, and hearing a lot about this in the news, and that is, again, visually representing diversity and that it matters. People realize this, and this is supported by research, that the media influences not only how others view them, but even how they view themselves or how we view ourselves. Adding diversity to a course seems simple enough, but we really need to avoid the trap of just adding photos of individuals with different skin tones and thinking that we've accomplished inclusion. So my question to you is every manager portrayed as a white male? Okay. What are the roles played by those in the visual? Is anyone a token character? Are all the women subordinates, i.e. office staff, or all the factory workers all minorities? Okay. Dress is also to take into consideration. Is dress gender-based with all the women in short skirts or low-cut tops? Are there and should there be people with religious or cultural headgear or other clothing? We need to have that full range of human diversity, which includes all things like ethnicity, race, size, ability, social economic background, and gender needs to be included. Now, as I mentioned, I've been in training and development for a long time. And in the past, we're talking early 2000s, it was challenging to find stock photography or video that got a comment, I see no glasses in those images, because you got me. I'm the visual representation this time. But yes, I get it. To find stock photography that was appropriately reflected those minority ethnic and societal groups that weren't blatant stereotypes or disrespectful to individuals. Thankfully, we now have access to training-specific image repositories, and what you actually see here on my screen, sorry, I'm looking at the monitor to make sure you're seeing it there, is a repository from the eLearning Brothers Stock Library, and they contain a great wealth of diverse images. Their libraries actually contain more than 120 million items, including stock photos, videos, cutout people. There's over 770 cutout people. Most of them have a range of between 40 to, some of them actually have several hundred poses. And you can access the libraries. They are included with Lectora, or again, they can be purchased separately. Yes, and there's a link. There's another link that I've got for stock photos for the Black and brown people too. Yes, and I've got another link, and it's more custom animations, and I will see if I can find those. Okay, great comment here. Is this tokenism? Not sure about India, but Canadian South Asian women do not wear those outfits in the workplace. I liked the outfit, which is why I put it in there, because I thought it was pretty. So yeah, we'll go from there. We also, when we're talking about inclusive practices, we need to make sure we use our voices. When designing diverse, inclusive e-learning, and actually when I worked at WorldCom, we had some ladies that would wear all kinds of things. So actually all kinds of people did, because it was very international, which I loved. We can increase the variety of the vocal talent by ethnic group, again, age, gender, dialect, and sound. When selecting voices, return again to that discussion of diversity within the company. Use the information about the company or organization to answer the questions: what characters or narrators do you need to include in your project? Do you have audio talent that sounds right for those characters? And is it possible to source vocal talent local to the client for authentic accents or dialectical speech? Now, I do want to caution you guys, though, when sourcing local talent, it can be a challenge, but it can also be a viable solution. And if you're looking for internal voiceovers, one of the things I usually ask is if people have experience singing. And that sounds odd, but people who have sung in a choir, with high school, college, church, doesn't matter where, but if they've sung in a choir, they usually know about their breathing patterns and their pauses, and they can do a pretty good voiceover for you. If your current talent pool does not reflect the sound you're looking for, you can try out Lectora's text-to-speech option, or you can browse through online audio websites like Voice 123. There you can filter by gender and age, and you can also post requests for audio talent. Now, here I did a search for females with Southern accents, and I found 79 results. When you're addressing issues of inclusion, a request such as this should include that you're not looking for a cartoon or overly exaggerated Southern accent. Fake accents are at best counterfeit and at worst insulting. Authentic voices, however, do resonate power throughout every aspect of of your organization. Okay. And enunciation, exactly. Now, when we think about inclusive language acknowledges diversity and conveys respect to all people. It is sensitive to those differences and promotes equitable opportunities. Please, though, remember that language is fluid. So meanings and connotations of words can change rapidly. So it is more important to apply inclusive language principles rather than always learning specific appropriate phrases, because again, these can change a bit. Some examples of inclusive language are, and you may recall from the beginning how I introduced myself. Introduce yourself with your pronouns. I am X, and my pronouns I use are she, her, he, him, they, X, Z, whatever it may be. Now, I do want to caution people on the phrases that are thought of being inclusive but are actually not, and that would be terms like sexual preference or preferred pronouns. Both of those terms are very inappropriate. Okay, so it would just be pronouns, not preferred pronouns. Use gender-neutral terms such as staff members, employees, folks, volunteers, visitors, members. Okay, I know for myself, I'm finally excited that y'all is actually now kind of a preferred term. And that's something I have said, which is definitely a Southern thing. Instead of assumptions about relationships or biological parents, spouses, things like that, assuming that there is always a mom and dad if you're talking about children, use terms like spouse or partner, significant other, guardian, parent, caregiver, grown-up, or responsible adult. Not everyone has a mom in the home or a dad in the home, or maybe mom or dad in the home. Be very careful what assumptions that you're automatically making. Okay. Also, we need to be careful about some of the phrases like sending a man to the moon. Okay, what about sending a woman to the moon? So be careful about these gendered or exclusive terms. And be careful about some of our slang. I teach also part-time at a local community college, and I have a lot of international students. So if someone were to say something like, it's raining cats and dogs, that may need to be explained to international staff members or visitors. There's also lots of slang out there like, man, that was awfully good. Okay, so was it awful? Was it good? What do you actually mean here? That is very contradictory. And English is a very challenging language because of these types of issues. And I need to continue on too. Also be careful about these stereotypes. Use factual language rather than value-laden words. So instead of things like that, old drivers are a liability, better to say something like, as people get older, sight loss is more common, and as a result, driving may become more difficult. Ask in advance if you're not sure of something, and someone made a great comment. When you're asking in advance, may not necessarily do it around other people, kind of take it one-on-one unless everybody is following the rules of here we're going to, like in my classes, we introduce, that's one of the requirements. You say your name, you say your preferred name, because a lot of my students don't like going by their name, and then what your pronouns are. So everybody's doing it, hopefully not to point anyone else. There are some exclusive language out there, and this one has been very challenging for me, and that's the term using guys. We mentioned we need to focus on this bias-free inclusive language. Words possess the ability to empower or debilitate learners in ways completely unintended by the writer. Using guys to address all people is gendered. Languages may insinuate, again, that men are preferred gender to your organization. Instead, use terms like folks, people, you all, y'all, teammates, staff. And I love what you guys are putting in the chat. I've got to make sure I go back and read some of that because it's interesting. It's very good. Girls or girl. For any female over 18 years old, women or woman is a better choice. It'd be better, again, if you just took that out in general and just say, again, folks or people. Okay. Grandfathering or grandfather clause. This had always been used as a way to exempt some people from change because the conditions that existed before the change. We've grandfathered some users in an unlimited data plan. Don't use this term. The term grandfather clause originated in the American South in the 1890s as a way to defy the 15th Amendment and prevent Black Americans from voting. A better alternative or a good alternative would be a legacy. You were on a legacy plan. Okay. Gypped, and could be a couple ways, gypped. This is a racial slur for being defrauded, swindled, or cheated. According to the Oxford Dictionary, the term is probably an abbreviation of gypsy, which is again a derogatory word commonly used to describe the Romania people. Let's not. Ghetto. The creation of ghettos was a key step in the Nazi process of separating and persecuting and ultimately destroying European Jews. In America, the term became associated with poor areas with non-white residents. Now it is kind of that bigoted term that gets tossed around to mean low class. Okay. Uppity. Whoops, go too fast there. This is used to refer a stuck-up or arrogant person, but again, during segregation, racist I'd say Southerners, but that's where it originated from, used uppity to describe Black people who, and I'm putting quotes here, who didn't know their place, socially, economically speaking. Okay. Originally, the term started within the Black community, but the races adopted it quickly. So let's just not use it. Handicap is another one. Some disability advocates believe this term is rooted in a correlation between a disabled individual and a beggar who had to beg with a cap in his or her hand because of the inability to maintain employment. A better alternative would be disabled. Housekeeping, in reference to office work, this language just in general feels gendered. So instead, maintenance, cleanup. American Indian or Indian in general, this language dates back to Christopher Columbus and the naming of people on Anglo-Saxon perception. This implies that these nations are only defined by how they were perceived by Europeans after 1492 when the people were massacred. Use the term Native American or First People would be a better term. Lame is another one, again, used in synonym for reduced mobility, often referred to as uncool. It is still ableist. Indigenous is another great term, thank you. Master slave is a term that was used a lot in the IT fields to refer to one machine that has the original copy to automatically update themselves. We're seeing this thankfully be replaced by primary and replica or primary and standby. Peanut gallery, this term of heckling for unwanted disturbance from the 1920s when the peanut gallery referred to the back section of the theater, which are the only places that people of color were allowed to sit. The phrase was meant to poke fun at the idea of people of color engaging in intellectualism. Don't use it. And Jude is the action of getting or trying to get better of someone by charging too much or paying too little. Obviously, cheating, swindling is another derogatory term to those of Jewish faith. So how is folks with disabilities different from differently abled? That would be fine. It's just, again, that handicap term that would be used. And great comment coming in, master bedroom in a home is better referred to as the main or primary bedroom. Exactly. Completely. And to move on. So let's talk now about some accessibility. It is up to you to ensure that you're designing your content for as many people as possible, including those, again, with those visual, hearing, motor, cognitive limitations. We call this concept accessibility accessibility or accessible learning. And the most important thing a developer can do is design with accessibility in mind. Knowing how to use the tools in your toolbox will be essential in your success. Lectora is an amazing, powerful tool. With that power comes the ability, we've talked about that somewhat in the chat, that there's definitely more than one way to do things, and not every approach will be accessible. So, a couple of things to just understand the basics of how it works, and it helps to understand how the courses work for those using assistive technology or the keyboard. The two most popular assistive technology screen readers are NVDA, which stands for Non-Visual Desktop Access, and JAWS, Job Access with Speech. And they are an assistive technology primarily used by people with vision impairments. They convert text, buttons, images, and other screen elements either into speech or actually into Braille. Okay. Now, in whatever tool you're using, you need to understand how it works with the screen readers. In some tools or online projects, you have to indicate what the individual objects are, but in Lectora, it's great. The indication happens automatically. So we referenced this earlier if you were still in Dominique's section. He talked about the Project Explorer. I'm going to kind of get a screenshot of what that is over there. It's the left-hand pane. And then the student view, basically once you've published it, what they would look like. So on here, we can see the Project Explorer, what's going on behind the scenes, and again, what's there for the accessibility. Okay. When we think about screen readers, the object at the top of the list, whoops, let me go back here, whoops. Okay, or the Project or Title Explorer, and Dominic went over this, but I'm not sure how many are in from there, but that's actually on the bottommost layer of the page. A screen reader would identify this object first. Alternatively, so we say busy highway at sunset. Alternatively, the one on the screen reader would identify the eLearning Brothers logo, since that's the 6th, has the very last item. Okay, so screen readers will identify the items from top to bottom. It will also, with Lectora, it will read the item's name from the Project Explorer for a button or image, and will add the word button or image to the image. So a lot of times we see traditionally people will write next button. Well, in that case, a screen reader would say next button button. Okay, that's too confusing. Or maybe button next button. Okay, you don't want them to have to hear that. So just know that the icon, if you're doing it for yourself, that icon there, that's a button. And Lectora will automatically tell the screen reader that it's a button, and it will put the word there. And the same with image. So I've got a picture here of an image. So it would say image of person walking with, I think it's supposed to say white cane, or person walking with white cane image. So it's going to add that in there so you don't have to. Okay. It will also automatically, when it sees a text block, as we can see here, we've got in the left, it says lesson plan or introduction, it will automatically read the content within the text block. Okay, so it already knows that. The other thing that you need to do is to make sure you add skip navigation. And in addition, basically, it's all those repetitive items, because you wouldn't want, when we looked at some of those, you wouldn't want it to say the logo each time. You wouldn't want it to necessarily talk about the home, help, next, all those buttons. So you can actually skip that, because you don't want to have to hear those every time. As a sighted user, mentally, I'm already skipping over it and jumping into the content. This allows those who are using screen readers or the keyboards to skip over that. So if I'm looking here at this sample here, it would start with section 508. I would see my skip to the page title. It would skip each time that logo, project name, home, help, exit, back, next, and jump down to my page title, which is set up, has an H1, which is an HTML tag. And again, there's a lot more of that in our book, Christine and I's book, and it would automatically jump down to that. And there's a couple different ways you can set up skip nav, and we've got a couple of them in there. So when we think about the screen readers and keyboard accessibility, this means that they need to be able to interact in the course using only their keyboard. So when you go through, put your mouse up, which is why I put an X over the mouse there, and go through your class just using your keyboard. So you're using your tab key to go forward and shift tab to go to the previous. That's pretty standard, and users who use this are used to that. And again, in Lectora, the project or title explorer is used to control that tabbing order of those clickable items. Okay, and there's again some great comments coming in, and some of that is, when we say differing abilities because they didn't want to be disabled, I've read a lot on that, and I think that's where it comes to some of that personal, find out what your end users, if you go out to some of those pages, the overall, like I love watching the Paralympics, watch the Paralympics for the regular Olympics any day, it's amazing. And it's so interesting, just they're also supportive of each other, which I love. When you go to those sites, some of the parent sites, that's where I get with my guidelines is the overall foundation. Just like some people, are okay being called, Miss Paxton, and some people are like, I don't want to be called Miss, I want to be called Chris or whatever. That some of it gets into the overall versus the personal. So when we think about, again, in Lectora, the project or title explorer is used to control the tabbing order. The tab key, again, to go forward, shift tab to go back. And again, it's based on the object's listed position, as we can see here from this graphic. The top item, skip to page title, would be the first, and then it would tab down. The biggest thing I can recommend for you guys is, again, practice using your tab keys. Make sure you have consistent navigation in as much as you can throughout your course. It is one of those that, maybe come up with a style guide, and this could be also true when we're thinking about some of the language and what the language guide. You can use a style guide not just for items, but also the verbiage and the terminology that you're using. Okay, that kind of stuff can go in your style guide, which is one of the things I recommend. One of the other things that you can do and that you will want to do is you can group items such as your navigation and ensure it is read after all the content on a page. And to navigate to the properties for that, we can see on here, I'm on that group properties, and I just set it for set reading order to last. Now, when you first start setting up your course, what's one of the first things you're going to want to do? Well, I strongly encourage people to set up a template. And I've just got a few minutes. So set your web accessibility settings. Again, we kind of talked about some of this last week in Lectora Live. So take a look at that. It goes into more detail about those web accessibility settings. Alt tags are set to empty, always on top. Okay, we'll go through all that. Some of the best practices and things that I recommend. No matter whether you're developing these courses for accessibility or not, and this is one of the things we do when we teach Lectora fundamentals, intermediate, so forth, is the naming. Just get into the practice of doing it consistently, making sure that naming and that order works well. Okay, items are named not only where you can identify them, again, because how often do you have to go back to a course a week, a month, a year later, but also so other people within your department can understand what it is, and make sure that the items, images, buttons don't have that word next to it. Making sure, again, for photos that you select alt tags for decorative images, those images that do not add information to the content of a page. And for those that you do need, because a screen reader will actually read the alt tags, it's going to read, in this case, it would say Section 508 compliance, and I believe that was logo. Whatever you do, do not leave that object name blank, or the screen reader would end up reading the image file name instead, 11020 JPEG. Okay, that's not going to make sense to anyone. The other one has a best practice is try not to use always on top. Okay, use caution when setting this property for an object, because this option places the object on the topmost layer of the page at the same time, and it makes it the first object identified by a screen reader, although you may not want it to. So it's better to use your project pane and use the order. A couple other things, accessibility checker, Lectora has that. I would recommend create a style guide, create templates. Dominic mentioned that. Use library objects. Library objects are amazing. If to more help, Check out the Rockstar community. Check out the Lectora Accessibility user group, which I think the link was updated in the chat. Also check out Interactive Advantage Lectora Training. We have books that Christy has sent out for you guys. There is the How Accessibility is Changing, Why It Matters, and What You Can Do, in addition to Making eLearning Accessible, which this one goes into more detail for everyone. Okay.
All right, Chris, that was an amazing wrap up. Speed talking for sure. That's a great presentation. The chat on this one has been absolutely amazing. Some really awesome suggestions and feedback from people in the chat. I think I'm actually just going to turn this chat thread into a blog so that we can have all of these ideas on our website forever. And
yes.
We do have to go on to our next session, but connect with Chris on LinkedIn if you want to talk to her more about this. We have tons of resources on our website as well. This has been amazing. Definitely, clearly a topic that needs some further conversation too. So we at eLearning Brothers, we will definitely keep this conversation going with future webinars and all of that. Chris, again, thank you so much for your time. It was fantastic. And
thank you.
Now, Mark, I will invite you back to bring up our next speaker.